Thank you so much. Oops. Daniel, it's great to be in conversation with you. I'm just going to leap in.
Okay.
So the Odyssey's having a moment. Ralph Fiennes just starred as Odysseus returning from the war. Christopher Nolan is shooting his adaptation as we speak. But the Odyssey's always having a moment, it seems like. And in your wonderful expansive introduction, expansive to this translation, which is the introduction, by the way, is worth the price of entry alone, you discuss the many places we see the Odyssey's influence without us knowing what we're seeing. Mm-hmm. The Bildungsroman, the picaresque novel, the road movie, structurally, the flashback, the ring structure. You even make a case for Homer's poem being the blueprint for romantic comedy. Even in obvious forms like that. So this poem of human life, as you call it, what is it? Why is it so pivotal to us, and why is it so eternally fresh?
Well, I think the Odyssey has an enduring appeal, partly because what's in it, and partly because of how it's made. So what's in it, obviously are some of the themes that we most rejoice in as human people, right? First of all, above all, it's a poem about coming home, and therefore raises questions about what does a home mean? What does it mean to return? Can you be the same person when you return as you were when you left, particularly after a long time? So it also involves questions of identity. The Odyssey, the climax, I'm sure many of the people in this room are aware of this, the climax of the Odyssey, the sort of fulcrum of the climax is that this person who has been gone for 20 years has to prove that he was the same person who left. But on the one hand, he's able to do that because they have shared memories, but in almost every other way, these two people have changed, right? I always tell my students, you cannot understand the Odyssey until you've been to your 20th high school reunion. It's about time, right? So it's about time, it's about marriage, it's about what connects people. The most fascinating thing to me, the more I think about the Odyssey, the more I think that it's in a weirdly sort of proto-modernist way, its great obsession is really time. And because as many of you know, it does not unfold in chronological order, right? It begins in the present, he's been gone for 20 years, they're trying to get him back, but then it leaps back in time. A big chunk of the middle of the poem is him reciting everything that happened to him since the day the Trojan War ended, blah, blah, blah. It leaps forward, it anticipates his death many years from now, right? So it's very, very convoluted. But when you unkink the chronologies that are embedded in the story, everyone knows. I'm sure if you walked out onto Lexington Avenue and you grabbed some random person, and you said, what is the Odyssey about? Even if they haven't read it, they know it's sort of about this guy who's trying to get home to his wife, right, after a long separation. But, when you do the math, their baby was an infant when he went off to the war, which means they may have been married for 10 months. So this is a story about a guy who's trying to get back to a girl whom he maybe knew for a year. No, think about it, right? And he spends 20 years so possessed by this sort of image of this person that he needs to go back to. And that's incredibly moving, right? So it's also about, and this is a romantic reading, but I don't think it's illegitimate, it's about the bonds that connect people in such a powerful way that it transcends time. So this is a laundry list of the stuff that's in it. But as I also alluded to, the construction of it is, I think, particularly to a contemporary audience, there are things in it we recognize. Right. Particularly flashbacks, flash forwards. Most of us recognize these from cinema and television, and even maybe more than from literature. Its construction is so involuted, it's sort of irresistible because you're always trying to sort of figure out where things are, And so that I was saying to somebody over dinner the other night, I actually think Christopher Nolan is the perfect person to make an Odyssey movie because he's very interested in exactly these things. Kinkily structured narratives that move back and forth in time and between dimensions. Also memory is a big thing for him. So actually I'm excited about that. But I think these are some of the reasons why it always seems to be speaking to us. And I'm actually going to add a final thing, which is the nature of the hero of the Odyssey is also sort of proto-modernistic. There's an aura of postness about the Odyssey. The Iliad takes place during the Trojan War. In the Odyssey, you always get the sense that everything is over. Even the gods aren't that present in the Odyssey, certainly not the way they're present in the Iliad. And that, I think, is something that we relate to. The feeling that everything is over and you still have to somehow make your way through a world in which all the old certainties have dissolved. So I feel it's very present to us in a lot of ways we understand.
I read it last before reading it for this conversation, your translation in college, and what I recalled was I thought the Odyssey was books 9 through 12.
Yeah.
And I didn't remember how much, there's 21 other books, or 20 other books, or whatever it is. And so I just thought maybe it would be good for the purposes of this conversation. Could you walk us through kind of a thumbnail sketch of the story of the Odyssey?
Not in chronological order.
Well, we start with, and then...
Well, we start, so the Odyssey starts anyone who goes to Italian operas understands how the Odyssey starts, which is that the main character doesn't appear for a long time. They always hold the soprano back until the second part of Act 1, right? So the Odyssey actually begins with 4 whole books that are not about Odysseus or not ostensibly about Odysseus. It's all about his son. Odysseus has left 20 years before to fight in the Trojan War. The war lasts 10 years, and then it takes him 10 years to get home. He left this baby and this young bride. The baby is now 20 years old, a young man on the verge of adulthood, but he's had no role models. And the first 4 books are concerned with the son going on a fact-finding mission to find out what happened to his dad. That's the beginning of a kind of a Bildungsplot, a growing up plot of a young man. It's only in book 5. But what the effect of that is you keep hearing about Odysseus until the action really gets going, but you don't get to see him until book 5, by which point you've been filled with all this information. People tell stories about him, they recollect him, blah, blah, blah. Then 5, finally, book 5 focuses on Odysseus, and the next 7 books sort of take him from this island where he's been imprisoned by a oversexed nymph. He is literally her sex slave. My students never understood why he left. They don't understand why he wants to leave because the text actually says every night she forces him to have sex with her. And, my late adolescent students think, why would you go back to Ithaca, actually? And so, until the middle of the book, he's getting back to Ithaca. And it is during the first half of the poem that you get the recitation, which is what you remember, and I think a lot of people think the Odyssey is the recitation of everything that happened to him. And that's where all the famous adventures come in. The Cyclops, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis, the Lotus Eaters, blah, blah, blah. And then the whole second half, the last 12 books, are him landing on Ithaca. Finally, he gets home with the help of these friendly people who are very good at sailing. And that's the revenge plot. So he has to come home. He decides he's going to be in disguise because he doesn't know who has remained faithful and who has betrayed him. So that's the Count of Monte Cristo, by the way, is completely riffed from that. And he comes back in disguise, and he gradually makes his way toward his own palace. There are a series of encounters with some loyal old servants, some servants who have not remained loyal. And the aim is to get to the palace, which he has to infiltrate in disguise, and eventually kill these 108 oversexed young men who are trying to marry his wife, and re-identify himself to his wife and his child and reclaim the identity that he has not had for 20 years. So most of the Odyssey is actually about Ithaca, in a way. You know, Aristotle is onto that. I mean, Aristotle really understands in the Poetics, you know, he says it's about getting back. That's the Odyssey. But we think of the adventures. And certainly when I was in high school, that's what hooked me when I read it for the first time. You know, the adventures. And it is like Star Trek, you know. I mean, there's all these strange creatures and people with weird habits. And, you know, and that's fun. But really it's about what's going on at home and how can you reconstitute what you left behind into some form that you recognize,
Right.
which is not easy.
Right.
You know.
So there was a recent translation by Emily Wilson of the Odyssey, which has been much commented on and read. And in your really fabulous introduction, you sort of get into some of the nuances of the decision that you made to translate it in hexameter, as opposed to, say, Emily, who translated in pentameter. And I think it's worth going into, considering how much people have been talking about that translation, the idea of what it is that you were doing that was different, and why perhaps that translation erring on the side of omission or choosing omission is maybe serving the original text less than what you sought to do.
Well, I mean, you know, there's no...
And some of those are my words, but...
There's no rule about how to translate the Odyssey. I mean, it's ultimately a matter of taste, you know, one's preferences. So typically in the history of English translations of Homer, in fact, English translations of classical epic in general, not only Homer, but also Virgil, and, you know, the go-to meter is what we call blank verse, right? Iambic pentameter. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. It's a 10-syllable line with 5 beats. And that is a natural rhythm for English to fall into.
Right.
And so it's quite typical that translators use that. I think readers recognize it. It's familiar. We know it from Browning, from Shakespeare. It's a, you know, so it's not a bad choice. Classical epic is in a meter called dactylic hexameter, which always sounds like a diagnosis, you know. Well, I'm afraid it's dactylic hexameter. And dactylic hexameter is an extremely long line. It's theoretically an 18-syllable line, which has 6 beats, right? So dactylic hexameter, the sort of pulse of dactylic hexameter is bum 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 bum. That's one line. And we have ba-dum 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 ba-dum. So it's not necessarily a problem, right? And so Homer's line is very long, 18 syllables versus 10. So basically it's twice as long. Also in a language which, no offense, is infinitely more shaded, supple, complicated, and efficient than English. So,
can you say something about that piece of it, the verb structure, for example?
So the Greek verbal system is incredibly complex. I think I once calculated that there's 146 forms of each Greek verb. So that means the verbs can do a lot more than English. English is a great language. I love it, but there are certain things it can't do. So for example, in Greek, you can express the idea of to the women who are about to be killed in one word. So you're taking a very long line in a language that can do that, and versus a short English line where we have to say to the women who will one day be killed, which is a whole line. And in Greek, it's one word in a long line. So what English translators have typically done is to use 2 or even 3 lines of blank verse to do 1 line of Homer, right, which is great, you know. To my mind, the problem, so look, there's all kinds of ways to do Homer, and Homer, famously, Homer's Greek line can do as many things at once, not all of which you can ever do in any English line.
Sure.
So it's stately, it's also archaic. You have to remember that the language of Homer is not a language anyone ever spoke. It's a purely literary language that's accreted out of many phases of the development of Greek, out of many different dialects. No one ever went around speaking Homeric Greek. And I always say, to like Joe Greek, say living in Periclean Athens, Homer probably sounded the way the King James Bible sounds to us. That is to say, it's familiar, but also strange at the same time. So one of the things that the Homeric line is speedy, right? It moves. I mean, I emphasized the length of it before, but it actually moves along. It manages to be sort of archaic and swift at the same time.
Right.
So what Wilson did,
good description of your translation.
Oh, well, from your lips to God's ears. So what I think the problem with the Wilson, so she went after the swiftness. She wanted something that felt
right, and it is swift,
and it is,
yeah,
and I think that's why a lot of people like it, right? It just, and that's one thing you can get. The problem was she wanted to have it be a line, not a line for line translation, but she wanted to have the same number of lines as the original.
I see. Right.
So the problem is that to just do the math,
right,
basically, right? So she has to cut a lot. I mean, there's no other way to put it. I mean, I and other people have calculated that she cuts about 25% of what Homer says in order to effect this Procrustean thing. And so a lot of the shading, gets lost. But, she has speed. So you're always going to throw a baby off the lifeboat. And you have to decide which baby you're going to throw.
It's not about litigating, whether or not. It's really just about the question of, in a moment where there's a translation that's gotten a bit of penetration in the culture, coming back to the same text and making a case for why a new translation is really valuable. Because I think your translation is really valuable, and so I think you just made that case. I don't want to belabor the point, but I don't want to send the impression we're trying to suggest something about Emily Wilson's work. It's just really about what you're doing.
Well, I would rather talk about what's important to me than what I think the problems are, with her thing. And, you could look at any translation and find things not to love.
Sure.
It's just the nature of the beast. No, if you want to know what Homer is like, buy 5 translations and sort of superimpose them one on top of the other, and you'll start to get a sense of what Homer is like. I would say rather this was true of my Cavafy translation as well. I'm a sort of philological translator. I'm trying to get everything that I see in each line of the Greek into the English, because, I was trained as a classic scholar. So when you read these texts and you teach them for many years, as I have, you want all the stuff that you love
right,
to be available to your reader, right? That's what I do. So I'm also a writer. And it's very problematic, as we know, to talk about Homer, because there was no Homer, and it was a lot of people. I think Homer was like Wikipedia, basically. Everybody's adding and editing and correcting and signing on under false names, and But I'll use Homer, to describe the process that created these documents. And whoever did this at the end of the day, however it came into being, it's extremely careful. It is, although it's oral, it's very literary. Somebody thought a lot about what these words mean, how the lines break, alliteration, assonance, all the things that we study when we study poetry. So to my mind, when you want to translate that, the job is to get as much of what you see into your language so it's available to your reader, that's what I see so it's partly a scholarly undertaking and partly a creative / poetic undertaking. But, I don't think, there's no translation, no matter how much you may disagree with it, that does harm to the original. Yeah. It's just a matter of taste. You can do Richard III performed by, naked people, with bananas on their heads.
But they're doing it in English,
and they're still,
hopefully.
Well, true. but I think it's a free country. But these are what the things that are important to me, and that what I wanted to bring across is like, and in the process of revising my translation, which I did with the help of my friend Jenny Clay, who's a great Homer scholar, we would have 2.5-hour Zoom sessions every week for 2 years, going over arguing over, well, yes, you got this shading of the word, but you've also got to get that shading of the word, So that's what I love. Yeah. It's like the crossword puzzle, it's a problem that you have to solve. So what I did in my translation is I said, to hell with blank verse, because I wanted to do a line-by-line translation, but I saw that if you're going to do that, you need a long line so you could get all the stuff in, right? So I spent a long time trying to develop a line that had 6 beats, wasn't totally imitating Homer's rhythm, but suggests Homer's rhythm. But I was very interested in amplitude, a full line. And it has a certain kind of movement, which to me is part of what a poem should have. Your introduction sensitized me to those nuances in particular because of this conversation you were having with some of the other translations. And it was very helpful to be seeing it through that. Do you want to maybe give people a sense of Yeah, I did not come unprepared. Yeah, so I've got 2 readings. I may not have time for the second one, but I'm reading just from a passage in book 5. So this is the book in which the camera, so to speak, finally turns to Odysseus. And what has happened is Zeus has sent Hermes, the messenger god, down to Calypso, the nymph who's been holding Odysseus prisoner as her sex slave, to tell her that she has to give this guy up and let him go home. And I'm just reading this passage because I think, so much of the Odyssey, I mean, we all know the famous episodes, but so much of it is just so beautiful. And there's a great description when Hermes obeys the order of Zeus and flies down to this island, which is so beautiful that even a god goggles. And so I'm just going to read that, but you'll hear that you'll get a sense of my line. So Zeus has just told Hermes that he has to go down to this island and free Odysseus. And Hermes is known as the guide or the slayer of Argos. So those are some of his epithets that you'll hear. His words, nor did the guide, Argos slayer, fail to heed him. Straight off he strapped the beautiful sandals onto his feet, immortal, made of gold, which bore him across the wet seas and endless expanses of land as swift as the breath of the wind. He took along the wand with which he lulls to sleep the eyes of any man he pleases, or awakens those who are sleeping. Holding it in his hands, mighty Argos slayer flew off. Swooping down, he set foot on Pieria. Then he plunged into the sea and skimmed along the breakers like nothing so much as a tern, which drenches its thick plumage in the brine as it hunts for fish down through the troughs of the breakers on the restless wastes of the sea. That is how Hermes looked as he darted through wave after wave. When he reached the island at last, it lies off at a great distance, he emerged from the violet dark sea and then made his way onto dry land until he reached an enormous cave where the nymph of the beautiful braids had her dwelling. There, inside, he found her. An enormous fire was burning upon the hearth, the aroma of blazing splits of wood, cedar, juniper, drifted all over the aisle while she lifted her lovely voice in song and wove back and forth at her loom with a golden shuttle. A luxuriant growth of trees spread out all around the cave, alder and black poplar and sweet-smelling cypress as well, and the birds inside them were sleeping, their wings outstretched, little horned owls and hawks as well as cormorants, their chattering tongues stretched out, birds who work the sea. Round about the mouth of the hollow cave, a vine had been trained to climb. Now it flourished, bursting with clusters of grapes. 4 springs, all in a row, flowed with the clearest water, their streams running side by side, then turning this way and that. All around there were velvety meadows where violets and bay grass were growing lushly. There, even a god who chanced upon this scene would marvel at the sight, pleasure filling his mind. The guide, slayer of Argos, stood marveling at the sight. But when he'd marveled at it all and gazed to his heart's content, he quickly entered the cave's wide mouth. As he stood before her, Calypso, that radiant goddess, did not fail to recognize him. For a god will never fail to recognize another immortal, not even one who lives far away from the others. But Hermes did not find great-hearted Odysseus inside. No, he was sitting by the shore and lamenting, as so often before, weeping and moaning and tearing his heart to shreds in despair. The tears poured down as he stared at the restless wastes of the sea.
Beautiful. In the wonderful book that you've written about teaching the Odyssey and your father joining the seminar called An Odyssey, your he has a real objection to the introduction of Odysseus as a hero because the guy is crying the first time you see him.
Yes, when my father took my class, he would constantly say his greatest objection was that the Greek warriors cried. He said, I was in the army, nobody cried.
And the passage you just read leads, invariably to Odysseus and Calypso. It's a version of a marriage scene. We've just come off one of the great marriage scenes in which Telemachus has gone to find out information about his father and gets the story of Helen and Menelaus. And then later, of course, Odysseus and Penelope. What does the Odyssey have to say about marriage is really the question, I guess.
Well, I mean, the Odyssey is, so as I mentioned, on the one hand, the center of its gravity, emotionally, one of its centers of gravity, is this marriage, right? He tells Calypso right after the passage I just read at the end of book 5. Calypso is very insulted that he wants to get back to his mortal wife. She's offered to make him immortal. It's not something she can actually do, but she makes the offer, and he says no, which that translates to, I would rather die and be with Penelope than have endless sex with a flawlessly beautiful, eternally young goddess and live forever. But that's important. Right. I mean, that says something about the quality of human life. What the Greek word, one of the Greek words for God is just someone who will not die, right? It literally means immortal, right? And so the Odyssey is very interested in the condition of human emotions, what makes us human, and why that gives the fact that we die makes our lives that much more precious and everything in them that much more precious. The gods must ultimately be trivial because they can't be hurt and they can't die, right? So at the one hand, you have this marriage, which is everything. I was going to say, he tells Calypso, I'm sorry. She said, I can't believe you're going to go back to this woman. She's middle-aged, look at me. She says, I don't think I'm her inferior, ha ha, And he says, yeah, I know, but, them's the breaks. So that's very moving. Yeah. He chooses death and aging with this one specific person rather than her. On the other hand, so that's one center of gravity. On the other hand, you get all these pictures of terrible marriages. The Odyssey has a lot to say about bad marriages. So it's haunted from the very beginning by people constantly talking about, with increasing specificity, another returning hero from the Trojan War whose wife did not remain faithful and who in fact killed him when he came home, which is Agamemnon, right? That's the plot of the Oresteia. And so that story keeps cropping up in different ways throughout the Odyssey as if to serve as a sort of counter model. This is the homecoming you don't want, but it's particularly the wife you don't want, right? She's shacked up with the cousin and they're plotting to kill him. But it gives you other portraits of difficult marriages. In Book 4, there's a fabulous scene in Book 4 where Odysseus' son, as I mentioned, who's the focus of the beginning of the poem, has gone to Sparta to interview Menelaus, one of his father's war buddies, whose wife, Helen of Troy, started the war. She ran off with Paris. And there's this great moment where the couple is trading, for the benefit of this youth, stories about the father. And it emerges, as first Helen speaks and then Menelaus speaks, that they're kind of at each other's throats. Because in her memories, she was a great hero, and she had regretted running away with Paris, and she only wanted to go back to her wonderful husband, Menelaus. And he remembers that she was trying to get the Greeks who were hiding in the Trojan horse to reveal themselves by imitating the sounds of their wives' voices, which is weird, right, that she can do that. Yeah. But she was walking around the Trojan horse knowing they were in there, mimicking, these poor guys, they've been away from their wives for 10 years. And so they tell stories at total cross purpose. So, you get this sense that she may say now, she's so happy, she says at one point, I can't imagine why I left you, you're so wonderful, but all is not right in the kingdom of Sparta. And then you get, pictures of these other royal couple where the wife seems to have an unusual amount of power and the husband has to keep sort of putting his foot down. So,
and young Nausicaa, who wakes up thinking about her eventual nuptials.
Yes, there's an enchanting thing where he lands on an island where there's this adorable princess who clearly has a crush on him. But, as he traverses the world, and you with him, so to speak, you're constantly given pictures of the wrong kinds of couples, so to speak, bad choices, which only refines our sense of why Penelope is the right one for him. And in fact, Odysseus, as I'm sure many of you know, is renowned for his cleverness, his trickiness. He's the only person in the Odyssey who tricks Odysseus is Penelope. Even Athena, the goddess of wisdom, cannot trick Odysseus. She thinks she has at one point, but he later makes it clear that he knew it was Sheol. So that's interesting, right? So it really is about, there's a famous passage where Odysseus tells the adorable young princess Nausicaa what his idea of a good marriage is, and he uses this wonderful word, homophrosyne, which means having like minds, having a kind of oneness of mind with someone. That's why Calypso is no good. She's got the body, but he has no homophrosyne with her. So it's a really fascinating document about what makes people, brings people together.
And interestingly, I think a lot of times we think that the Odyssey is about Odysseus finding Penelope again, that the central through line is really marriage in a way.
Yeah.
But structurally speaking, it starts with a son and it ends with a father and a son. So in a way, that's maybe structurally at least the real through line. What does it have to say about fathers and sons?
Well, you have to remember, this was a deeply patriarchal culture, and a lot of, it could be that most of the real estate in the Odyssey is actually given over to fathers and sons more than husbands and wives. I became acutely aware of this, of course, when I had my father as a student in my class, constantly challenging me. And so I was thinking a lot about fathers and sons, and I began to see, for the first time maybe, just how much of it is about fathers and sons. And as you mentioned, we both talking about how it opens with the son dreaming of this father that he's never known and hoping he can live up to this fantasy. That's in book one. He's literally sitting there while the suitors are feasting and carousing, and he's dreaming that his daddy would come back and sweep them out of the house and reestablish himself. And it's very important to remember that the final reunion in the Odyssey, so we know that once he gets back, he has a series of reunions in one could say, an increasing order of emotional importance. It's an ascending scale with various people to whom he had a connection, back in the day. And the climactic reunion is actually with the father, not with Penelope. Penelope is book 23. In book 24, the final book, is when he goes and seeks out his father. And I might say, and I'm not joking now, something I really appreciated when I did have my dad as a student and was thinking about this in a profound way. He starts to tell the father, he's still unrecognizable, and he starts to tell the father one of his preposterous lies that he's always saying, and he can't do it. He breaks down. The father is the only one he can't lie to. And I think that's very significant. Well, in a patriarchal culture, who's the person you're most afraid of, right? And I think that's very profound. And in fact, the final scene, so to speak, is a battle scene in which Odysseus and the son, now comrades in arms, so that completes the maturation arc for this young boy. It's Odysseus, the son, and his elderly, decrepit father, who's been miraculously rejuvenated by Athena, make war against the irate relatives of the suitors that they have killed. So it's this patriarchal sort of tableau is what the poem ends with. So that is the sort of countervailant force to the marriage plot, so to speak, is this business with fathers and sons. And it's quite interesting.
Speaking of your father, Jay, who was in that class, in the book you quote him as saying, I guess you're having some trouble with math, either in high school or college, I don't remember.
Always. Yeah.
And he says to you that if you didn't know calculus, you couldn't see the world clearly.
No.
And then you respond in the book brilliantly, I think, by saying you counter that you can't really see the world clearly if you haven't read certain classics in their original languages. And I asked you this question before because I wanted you to think about it. Those of us who don't have ancient Greek and Latin, like myself, what are we missing? And what can a translation convey some of that? Is that some of your calling in translating this?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I said, every language is beautiful in its own way, sure, right? But there are, as I mentioned, there are things English cannot do. So imagine that you're part of a civilization whose language can do to the women who are about to be wed in one word, right? You're experiencing poetry in a completely different way. And that, you can't do that. I mean, the whole point of translation is not to do that, right? The whole point of translation is you have your language, and that's the clay that you're working with. So you're looking at you, and it's like I'm trying to make a statue of you, and I only have, one kind of clay, and that's the best I can do. But you do the best that you can.
Does that sensory and intellectual density that you're talking about in the Greek correspond to a different modality of consciousness for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the language is the image of a civilization. I mean, I say that because I'm a philologist, right? But I mean, that's the image of a civilization. It's how people think, right? And so ancient Greeks thought differently because they had different words to use. But you do your best. You know, sometimes it's not even as elevated as the thing we're talking about. Sometimes there are just words you wish you could have a word for that it was as great as there's a wonderful epithet for the sea, the resounding surf, crashing surf, polyphlos boia, right? And I wish there were an English word that sounded that juicy to do that, but there isn't. You just have to deal with what you've got.
Just to nerd out a little bit, there's that wonderful scene with the Cyclops, and when Odysseus tells him, like Abbott and Costello, who's on third, it's my name is no one, and then that becomes the
right.
And there's the sort of unipolar way in which that pun is working in English is so different in the Greek. Could you give us a sense of the richness of what's happening there?
So I'm sure many of you know this story. So one of the adventures he gets involved with this terrible one-eyed monster, the Cyclops. And he knows from the beginning, even before he enters the Cyclops cave, he's always on the lookout for danger because he's a smart guy. So he never knows who he's going to run into. So he meets the Cyclops, to make a long story short, and the Cyclops says, "What is your name?" And he says, "My name is no one." Right? In Greek, outis means no one. Ou means no, and tis is an indefinite pronoun, somebody. So no one. It's exactly the same. So as we all know, eventually he thinks up this clever way of the Cyclops imprisons him and his men in the cave, and he starts eating the men. And Odysseus finds a way he gets him drunk, he falls asleep, he puts out his one eye, and during this violent scene, the neighbors come running and say, "Cyclops, is anyone hurting you?" And he says, "No one is hurting me." And so they say, "Oh, okay, then we'll go back home," right? So that's the joke. But it's actually so there's no way to do this in English. So everyone can translate outis, no one. Right? The problem is that in another way of saying no one in Greek is metis, not outis, but metis. Depends. So we would say, "Is anyone home?" No one is home. And sort of the same thing in Greek. So when the neighbors say, "Is anyone hurting you?" the word that they use is metis. And he responds, "No one is hurting me." But metis in Greek not only means no one, but it means cunning intelligence. So he's simultaneously saying, "No one is hurting me, but cunning intelligence is hurting me," which is the truth, right? So there's no way to do that.
And outis,
you just have to write a note.
And outis,
which basically is what I just recited.
Which is what you did.
You can't do it.
And interestingly, outis is also a distant play on Odysseus.
That's my because the point is he got the Cyclops drunk, and if you were really drunk and said Odysseus, it might sound like outis. There's another level because, of course, Odysseus, remember, the arc of the poem is he's trying to get home and reestablish who he is. But in all the time he's been away, he is no one. Everyone thinks he's dead. People thought he died years ago. So he really is, it's a lie that is also the truth, that is also a lie, that is also the truth.
Beautiful.
So do that.
We should probably start thinking about some questions. So just before we leap into questions, you obviously are a scholar of classical Greek, and then you translated Cavafy in modern Greek. You spent a lot of time in that idiom, in that atmosphere, and now back to classical Greek. Can you talk a little bit about that journey?
Well, I just like Greek, you know. I mean, it's a funny thing to translate both modern Greek and classical Greek, because they're not, you know, it's like translating Old English and contemporary English. They're quite different, and yet there is a continuity also. And I got interested in modern Greek when, as a graduate student in classics, I was often going to Greece during the summer to do archaeological programs and stuff like that. And at a certain point, I thought, you know, I'm spending so much time with these people, it would only be polite to learn their language. And there's a kind of historical tension about this. This is a whole sort of colonialistic attitude on the part of Western European and Americans towards the actual Greeks who are living here. You know, they act as if they don't matter. And I just sort of fell in love with modern Greek as well as classical Greek. And Cavafy, as you know, is a poet who is very interested in the Greek past, so it was a sort of perfect vehicle for me. But I just appreciate, you know, there's something about this language that has always had a great allure for me, and so I'm trying to give it a little something back.
This is a question which I'd wanted to sort of raise, but I know this is a rabbit hole that we could spend days on. But I think the audience is going to be interested in your answer to this. You alluded to it a little bit earlier, but could you go into a little bit more deeply the Homer question? Do you believe Homer was a real person or multiple separate writers? Why was that? What is your feeling or your understanding about that?
So, I mean, this is what's called, there's a thing, if you're a classicist, and it's called the Homeric question. Capital H, capital Q. And what that means is, you know, people used to think there was a guy called Homer, he was blind, and he wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and people thought that for a very long time. And then for one reason or the other, starting basically in the 18th century, people started to figure out that there were things in the poems, certain kinds of inconsistencies, you know, the fact that, as I also mentioned, the language is sort of accreted out of many different phases of the evolution of Greek. Some documents turned up that indicated that even the ancients were arguing over whether different passages were really by Homer, and they said, well, you know, if the guy had written it down and published it, they wouldn't be having these arguments. So that was the beginning of what they call the Homeric question. And, you know, people eventually, I think most classicists now believe that these poems evolved over a very long period of time. They started out maybe as individual short episodes. You know, you would come to dinner and you would say, oh, do the one about the Cyclops. I love that story so much. And you would sing a thing that was maybe 200 lines long. At some point, these pieces started accreting. Remember, this happened before there was writing, so it's all orally transmitted. And then eventually, at some point, somebody who had access to writing, who must have been a great poet and an editor at the same time, you know, sort of pulled it together. Or some people, or it was a committee, I don't know. But, you know, they took this stuff that had been floating around and they organized it, because the structure of these two works, the Iliad and Odyssey, is so intricate. It's not accidental, you know. So the person I think of as being Homer is whoever, or plural or singular, was the person to sort of massage it into its current shape, which it's hard to believe you could do that without writing. You know, so that when I say Homer, I'm always
mean Maxwell Perkins.
That's what I'm talking about. But you can't do the 3-minute disquisition that I just did every time you want to talk about how this thing happened. So you just say Homer.
Interestingly, in the introduction, you mentioned that these two works were part of a cycle of works. So there were multiple works about the entirety of the Trojan War.
Well, there was a cycle called the epic cycle, which was a cycle of epic poems, 8, which treated everything that had to do with the Trojan War, starting with the marriage of Achilles' parents, down to the weirdest, most attenuated ramification, which is that it turns out that Odysseus had a son with Circe named Telegonus, and when he grows up, he wants to find his father, and he goes to Ithaca, and he meets this grumpy old guy on the road and kills him, and then he goes to this capital city, and of course it turns out the guy he killed was Odysseus, and he marries Penelope. So that was the epic cycle. What? That's the one I want to find in the sands of Egypt. And so we don't know what the relationship of the Iliad and the Odyssey was to this cycle, whether they were beside it or part of it, or, but there was a lot more.
Right.
You always have to remember when you're talking about classical literature, you're talking about the tip of a very immense iceberg, most of which none of us will ever get to see, right? We talk about things like tragedy, and honestly, don't quote me, I know this is being live streamed, never repeat this. We don't know what we're talking about. Sophocles wrote 120 plays, of which we have 7, right? And people write dissertations about Sophoclean tragedy. They don't know what the hell they're talking about. The rest of them could have been like Seinfeld for all we know. So I think, all kidding aside, I think you always have to remember you're talking about a shadow of most of what we don't know about.
You've written about the value necessity of myth, the Titanic, the Kennedys. What do you believe is the value of epic narrative? What is Odysseus' gesture of returning home trying to solve for us?
Well, I think, like all great literature, it asks more questions than it answers. So I'm going to evade this question in a very fascinating way, which is, as I said, I think the Odyssey raises essential questions about identity, right? Everyone who, when my mother turned 80, I called her, and it happened to be while I was teaching my father in the class, and I said, how do you feel? It's her birthday, but I had to teach. She said, I'll tell you how I feel. Every morning I wake up, and I go to brush my teeth, and I look in the mirror, and I say, who is this old woman? And that's what the Odyssey is about, right? Because we hold two things in a weird kind of suspension, which is that we are always I to ourselves, and we think we know what that is, and yet we are changing all the time, and in fact can become unrecognizable in some external way, and yet we always feel that we are who we are, whatever that means. I think that's the central question of the Odyssey. As I said, he has to prove he was the same person, but of course he can't be the same person. Nobody is the same person, even if you had a placid, uneventful life, let alone Calypso and Cyclops, right? So that, I think, is, to me, the most interesting thing about, as I get, not surprisingly, as I get older, you recognize that the paradox of human existence is that you are both a single thing and multiple things all the time, and we somehow bring it off.
In reading your translation at this particular moment, it was hard not to be thinking about the question or the sort of way in which Odysseus is really a refugee through so much of it, and the idea of hospitality as a kind of central glue in our civilization or in civilizations. I mean, given all the political events and the financial events that have been happening over the past days, the way that hospitality, welcome of the other, a certain sacrality to that ethic is at the essence of being able to make your way in the world. I don't really have a question. I was just very struck by that in reading it.
Well, I was talking about how much I love Greek, just the Greekness of Greek. So in Greek, the word for stranger and the word for guest is the same word. So the act of hospitality is of necessity a recognition of the foreignness of the person that you're bringing into your house, which is a risky move, but one that can pay off if it turns into a reciprocal arrangement. So I host you, and then when you come to my country, you host me. Remember, I always tell my students, in an era before credit cards and airline apps. You had to be able to go along the world, and you did it by a series of these reciprocal relationships, which were taken with the utmost seriousness. So the word that I was talking about is xenos, Xenos. It's where we get xenophobia. And boy, do we have it more than ever. And so the institution that recognizes the importance of guest-host relations is called xenia. And the Greeks treated this with, it may be the only absolute principle in all of Greek civilization, more even than religious practice, that this is the essential thing that has to be recognized. In one of his forms, Zeus presides over this guest friendship, xenia. There's Zeus xenios, Zeus who presides over guest-host relation. And if you offend it, it's a mortal sin. That's why the suitors are killed, not for trying to wed Penelope. It's because they have violated the hospitality of the host. They have besieged his palace. They're eating his food. They're abusing his. That's why they have to die. So this was a central tenet of Greek civilization. And as you rightly recognize, in a poem that is about somebody who is always visiting other people's houses, sometimes illicitly, sometimes not, that's a very important, it's a central part of the Odyssey. That, by the way, is why everyone now feels sorry for the maids who get hanged. That's now a big thing. We all have to weep for the maids. But in fact, the ringleader of the maids who slept with the suitors, blah, 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 is deliberately portrayed by Homer as someone who violates xenia. When Odysseus confronts her in disguise, so she doesn't know it's her former master, she abuses him, she rails at him, she mocks him. That's the sin. It's very important. You have to see these things in their own terms. It's always a mistake to import our notion. So we say, oh, the poor little maids. But no, they all have to die because that's the mistake they made. That's how I see it. And I suspect that's how they might have seen it.
What was the hardest line to translate?
I can get out of this by saying book 6, line 371.
I guess it raises the question that I had, which we skipped because wanted to cover as much ground. Is polytropos is obviously the first. It's the way that he's described in the first line, and there's so much controversy. Some render it many-turned. Wilson offers complicated. Lattimore of many ways. Fagles of twists and turns. Fitzgerald skilled in all ways of contending. You render it thus. Tell me the tale of a man, muse, who had so many roundabout ways. And then you do a beautiful enjambment with the next line.
To wander.
To wander. So many roundabout ways to wander.
Well, that's what, if I may say, that's what the Greek does, right? So famously, everyone loves it. The first line of the poem says, tell me about this man. It's interesting that he's not named, So from the start, his identity is a problem. A man who is, and then there's this famous adjective, polytropos, literally meaning having many turns. And it's clearly a reference to him as a character, right? He's sneaky. He's not someone who does something in a direct way. He does things in oblique ways. His mind is always turning things over, right? You could milk that in a lot of ways. But the construction in Greek, and then the next bit is the man, this polytropos man, who, right, wandered very far and was set adrift after he sacked the holy keep of Troy. Typically, in that construction in Greek, the who clause is very clearly meant as an elaboration of the adjective, so it's explaining the adjective. And in that sense, it's a word that describes the route that he takes, right?
And
he doesn't go home like this.
It actually
describes the construction of the Odyssey. So in other words, he doesn't go home like this, he goes home like this. That's polytropos. So you have to find a way in English of conveying something that could be a quality of mind or habit, but also could be a description of a route. That's the challenge, right? So I always liked Fagel's twists and turns. I had Twisty for a long time, who had so many twisty ways. But I thought it was a little Dickensian. And then this is a true story, I was driving to Hudson, we're upstaters, and they got rid of that light and they put a roundabout.
Yeah.
And and nobody in America knows how to use roundabouts, and that's what I was thinking literally at the moment. I was thinking the thought, no one in this frickin' country knows how to use roundabouts, and I thought, roundabout? Because it has the turning, and also you say someone has roundabout ways, there's something it's not straightforward, but it's also
Well, you're in
circular.
gem, and it's the first time I understood
But I wanted
that.
to do,
Yeah.
but what the poem, I wanted to mimic the syntax of the poem, which is, if you end at the end of the first line, it says, tell me the tale of a man muse who had so many roundabout ways, period. So that looks like it's about him. But it actually enjams to who wandered far and wide, blah, 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 blah. So that's how, and jam, is something Homer knows how to use,
Wow.
So that, I think, is that's the word everyone looks at from the beginning.
Right.
But I think people may be overthinking it.
Sure,
Don't
but
quote me, but
it is something people talk a lot about.
It's also a very rare word in Greek. It's a very rare, right, Jenny? It's a very rare word in Greek. So then your question is, do I use some very rare word? But then it starts to feel, I don't think, you have to balance all these considerations, right?
So we've talked about you as a translator, but of course you are an extraordinary American writer, I think one of the great writers of American sentences, and I wonder what it is spending the years you've spent translating the Odyssey. What have you learned from the Homer, the editor, the source, the author, as a writer?
Well, I think because I've been, thinking about this basically my whole adult life. I don't think very well until recently, but I have been thinking about it. I think for me as a writer, and I've written a whole book about this, so, Homer liberates you to think about structure in a completely unconventional way, which I've always done in my own books, right? So you get to a point in your life as a writer where you suddenly realize you can do something and you don't need permission to do it. Like, oh, I can do that.
Right.
I remember when I was writing my first book, I literally called my agent, because I was actually writing a book about gay culture in New York in the 1990s, but there was this thing in Ovid's Metamorphoses that I thought was very important to mention. And I called my agent, this is how timid I was. I said, can I put Ovid's Metamorphoses in my book about gay culture? She said, it's your book, you could do whatever you want. And I was like, whoa, this is really fun. And, but I do think that the structure of the Odyssey is so remarkable that it opens up so many possibilities. And I think I've always had that in my head, even before I understood that. So I wrote a whole book called The Lost, which is essentially a descent into the underworld, which I don't know if I was consciously thinking of the Odyssey, but it's certainly kind of modeled on that. So I do think when you have, if you're a certain kind of person and you're a reader and you have certain works that you don't feel you own them because they're greater than you are, but you feel that they're yours somehow, they're in your bones. You're thinking about them even when you're not thinking about them. And I think this is the thing I've been thinking about more than anything else.
Daniel Mendelsohn, thank you for this translation, and thank you for
Thank you. Thank you.